Welcome, dear listener, to Let's Dig Deeper, the podcast where we talk all about archaeology, history, art, and culture. My name is Zinat Haroun, and I am a student of classical archaeology here at the University of Copenhagen. And in this podcast, I'm going to take you along for interviews with some of the delightful people working in the field. We'll talk with archaeologists, art historians, even just regular historians, and hopefully we'll learn more about the past in the process. And today, I'm joined by the amazing Tim Flor Sørensen. Welcome to the studio, Tim.
Thank you so much.
And Tim, you are a lecturer here at UCPH with a background in prehistory, and you are a researcher working in the field of contemporary archaeology with a focus on the philosophy of science and aesthetics. And among other things, you research ruins, post-industrial architecture, and Anthropocene landscapes. And in 2024, you won Einar Hansen's Research Foundation's Award for Outstanding Humanistic Research. Congrats on that.
Thank you.
And today, the topic is contemporary archaeology in all its different facets. Before we really dig into the subject, I'd like it if you could give us a quick introduction. So Tim, for someone listening who doesn't know anything about contemporary archaeology, what is it? What should they know, and why should they care?
Well, it's a basic question and also a broad question, but I'd say that contemporary archaeology is characterized by being the study of the archaeological remains or the physical material traces that are left behind by our own existence on this surface. So it's basically the very recent remains that we can call archaeological, that are left behind by ourselves or by our recent ancestors or other people that we share this planet with, or perhaps also other kinds of species as well.
Okay, thank you. I feel like that gives us a really good starting point, especially like what you said about recent history, right? We'll dig more into the bounds of what contemporary really means. But let's go beyond the tip of the iceberg. Let's dig deeper. So Tim, one of the most interesting things that I've learned about contemporary archaeology is that there's this whole concept of garbology, the science of literally studying our own garbage. And some say that all archaeology is studying old garbage. I have mixed feelings about that. But what is the actual discipline of garbology, if you can call it that? What is it? How did it start?
Well, actually, as far as I know, it really started as something that wasn't quite archaeological, not even academic. As far as I've been informed, it was started by a guy called A.J. Weberman, an American guy who was deeply fascinated with Bob Dylan. So he started ruminating around his trash, exploring what bits and pieces he could obtain of knowledge of Bob Dylan's life. So it's really a fan who was obsessed by his idol and then started exploring whatever trash he could find from him, which was, of course, not legal, but also quite unpopular. Bob Dylan apparently complained about this practice.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it's a violation of all sorts of privacy rights. But later, and also I think quite detached from this curiosity, it was more developed by Bill Ratje, an archaeologist, American archaeologist, who was starting in the early 1970s to explore what kinds of archaeological knowledge could be extrapolated from landfill sites. So all of the places where garbage was dumped, he was beginning to see that as a source of information, very much actually like archaeology has been approaching middens all over the world, famous in Scandinavian archaeology from the kitchen middens of the Mesolithic era in southern Scandinavia, where basically all of the trash that was deposited by past human inhabitants of these sites has been explored as a treasure by archaeologists since the late 19th century. And in some respects, you can say that Bill Ratje and this whole project, garbology project, was in some sense the same as what archaeologists have always been doing, except shifting the focus from the deep past to recent past. So exploring what present day, as of 1973, Americans were depositing, either in terms of the municipal waste on landfill sites or more individually in terms of their household waste.
And that's really fascinating because garbage production has really exploded in the last century, you could say, and even stuff like, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is just like floating islands of garbage in the ocean. So it should be something that occupies us, and I think it's interesting that archaeologists have dug into the garbage, literally. But it really begs the question of how we, as archaeologists, decide what is important and what's most most interesting to explore? Because the sense that I get from garbology is that the answer to that question is literally everything. It's all interesting, or how do we really decide that?
Well, I think it really depends on the kinds of questions that we're asking. So it very much depends on what kinds of concerns we have as academics, as archaeologists. And I think that what Bill Raj's Garbology project and other kinds of projects have shown is that there are different kinds of levels of interest or matters of concern, you can say, in terms of the garbage that we're looking at. So also when you're pointing to concerns about garbage in present-day landscapes and the garbage patch or the plastic patch in the oceans, I think that you can zoom in on different scales of attention. So of course you can look at consumption patterns, and you can start exploring what people are consuming. But of course, and that's also been part of Raj's Garbology project, we can start interviewing people about what kinds of products they are buying, how much they're buying, what kinds of consumption patterns they are then becoming part of, whether they throw out fresh meat or if they actually eat it after having purchased it, and so on. And that's one of the ways that we can go through their garbage to see whether their reported consumption patterns match the actual archaeological evidence in that sense, and get some sort of feel of how this actually works. But there's a different level or a different zone of interest, in a manner of speaking, where we are not looking at the individual household or consumer, but where we are looking at where things end up, whether they're ending up in designated garbage disposal areas, in repositories, in controlled environments where they're then somehow managed, or if they're ending up in the oceans. So allegedly that has also been one of the later sort of a latent aftermath of the COVID pandemic, that in 2021 I read a figure that globally there was 289 million face masks produced every month.
That's insane.
Yeah, and that's plastic-based. And of course, we all knew where to place them once we were done with them. But they are also swimming around in the oceans, and they're washing up on the shores. And depending on currents and where they have been thrown out, they are actually, in some places, polluting beaches to a very great extent, and also harming sea life and so on.
So in 700 years, we'll still find COVID masks in the ocean?
Intact or disintegrated, but they will remain as traces in the oceans, presumably. So that's also one of the ways of looking at garbage in archaeology, that it's interesting to see where things that end up, whether that was intentional or a side effect, or just a matter of not really caring or not coping with the actual trash reality. That's of course also a question.
Yeah, definitely. And I think beyond just garbage, I think one of the things that people might also think of when they hear contemporary archaeology as this sort of category is stuff like modern ruins, which is just a different sort of garbage, right? And urban exploration and these things. And what is it about these abandoned places that are so magnetic for people, that draws people in? And I've heard from you also that these places are also relevant for archaeologists. Maybe it can even count as fieldwork.
Yeah, I would like to think so. Otherwise, I don't do much fieldwork. But I think some of the attraction, we can of course distinguish between the professional attraction and the kind of interest we can have when we're looking at these sites with an academic gaze, and when we have research questions, or if we are drawn to them for other kinds of academic reasons, or looking at them in terms of how people use them as a sort of rogue tourist sites in terms of urban exploration, or as sites of vandalism, or just hanging out and or going exploring. And maybe there's not always a great difference in terms of what triggers people in terms of arriving in these places in the first place. So perhaps even the archaeologist might be looking at some of these ruins and then have that kind of romantic attraction to this desolate place, ruinous place, which is sparking a lot of questions in terms of what has happened here, why is it abandoned, what's left, what kinds of adventures does this place open up for? So
it's a sense of curiosity, really.
Very much. And I think that there's perhaps even also a kind of new romantic wave, in a sense, and where we don't have the same opportunity as in past centuries of going exploring the white patches on the map. Of course, we all know today that those white patches were usually inhabited by people who are just not Westerners or white, and who in a number of instances were then disenfranchised involved in that process. And some of the same procedures are actually going on today, because these ruins are often talked about as abandoned today, but in a number of cases they are the tragic home of people who don't have anywhere else to go. They might be sites of trafficking, and they might be sites of other kinds of use that are going under the legal radar for people who are trying to hide or being stored in other kinds of activities. So it's a really, really delicate kind of site. Very often we are looking at these ruinous places, industrial ruins or abandoned homes and so on, as sites of curiosity. But usually when we are looking more carefully at them and trying to explore why they turned into ruins, then very often they are also the expression of some kind of tragedy, or at least a social process and an economic process in our society that should give us reason for thinking about other things than just how much curiosity we can invest in this place and what wonderful pictures you might be able to capture with this romantic gaze. So I think they are in some cases more to be regarded as open wounds than as these romantic ruins. And I think that's begging a lot of academic questions.
Yeah, and I think it lends to reflection on, we're talking about the physical bounds of contemporary archaeology, something that's recently abandoned in air quotes, because if it's not really abandoned, but in a chronological perspective, what are the time constraints of contemporary archaeology? You mentioned that the garbology movement started in the 70s, but I imagine that contemporary, I mean, what does that word really cover? Does my trash from yesterday count as contemporary archaeology, or my lunch wrapper from today, or how do we really define what is contemporary?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and also important because I feel it's quite difficult to give a distinct and well-defined answer. But I think that one of the ways that I'm trying to think about the contemporary is that it's something where the time of what I'm looking at, or rather the temporality of what I'm looking at, is contemporary with me as a researcher or with my own context, which means that there are not really any kinds of closed chapters. What I'm facing in my fieldwork is something that is still active. So, of course, in archaeology, as you know, all of our periods and phases and epochs and sequences, that's something we're producing ourselves. They're not given. It's actually an analytical construct when we call something archaic or Bronze Age or whatever, or medieval. But the way I would like to think about our contemporary archaeology is that the traces that we're confronted with in contemporary archaeology, it's difficult to look at them with an exclusively retrospective gaze. They are also part of our own society and our own times. And I think also that one of the qualifying aspects is that they are also pointing towards the future. They are still in need of some kind of management as open, active elements in our own engagements with our surroundings. So that's a different kind of temporal or chronological definition than if you were asking me to define the early Bronze Age. Then I'd probably be talking about some specific years. Here, it's a different kind of response because it's more to do with the material processes that are still active in aesthetic ways and in sensory ways and in structural ways. But it's also to do with the relationship between archaeology and memory, where very often we think about archaeology as something that is related to history because it's about the past. But as some of our colleagues have also argued, maybe archaeology is more closely associated with memory, again because of these temporal processes. That memory is always constantly having to respond to some kind of formation and deformation processes that are things that are coming into being, accumulating, and other things that are deforming and degrading and falling into oblivion. And I think that that's also part of the archaeological process, that are things that are building up and transforming, but there are also things that are vanishing or even becoming quite unimportant while we're looking at them. And that's something that I would argue is somehow different to looking at a more traditional kind of past in archaeology. If we're talking about the Mesolithic or even the medieval, then usually we would have a kind of awareness that anything we encounter is important, anything is a source of information, anything we're looking at is a kind of data. But I think in contemporary archaeology, it's much more open. We can't be sure that this is actually a very significant element of our present day. And it may also be disintegrating while we're looking at it. It may be falling into oblivion.
The memory thing, I remember hearing that contemporary archaeology is to be defined within a few generations of memory, right? And as soon as that past generation sort of dies out, I guess you could say, then the new generation is the new contemporary. Because then it would sort of fall into that more broader past definition, right?
Yeah.
So the contemporary, as I understand it, is something that keeps being renewed the further we also advance into time, and we leave more and more stuff behind us as well, right?
Yeah, I think that in that manner speaking, that the more time that passes, then what used to be contemporary archaeology yesterday is perhaps in some respect turned into history. Then it becomes a different kind of narrative, becomes closed off as chapters of the past rather than remaining open. But I think that with the whole gaze contemporary archaeology, we might even open up aspects of the deep past that are considered closed chapters, where we are narrating in hindsight. Because if we're looking at the different kinds of landscapes that we're working with in archaeology, when we are digging deeper, then we're also opening up pasts in ways that are reactivating. And suddenly, I mean, again, referring to some of these disenfranchised people all over the world that had been basically bereaved of their past because of colonial enterprises and so on. Suddenly it was the West that came to define their past. Sometimes archaeology is capable of re-encountering previous pasts that were then falling into oblivion. And we can then open up some of these narratives that were sealed off or remained silenced somehow. And then those pasts are actually not only retrospective. They're very much a part of people's identities today. And I think that that's another way of looking at the contemporary element in archaeology, that it's also about how these kinds of narratives are maybe sometimes becoming active again and redefining identities or redefining abilities to be politically active or have agency in the world.
Yeah, so to help uncover what has been sort of hidden away even in our own contemporary time, right?
Yeah.
But if we then dig deeper into our own contemporary and recent past, what is it that we're even looking for? What depth are we seeking in our own society? And can you even talk about depth if the whole discipline is mostly based on, visible surfaces and what you can easily find?
Yeah, I think it's challenging, difficult, but also productively difficult to talk about a distinction between the deep and the surface in contemporary archaeology. Because, of course, contemporary archaeologists also go excavate, but there's a different kind of attention to what's on the surface, because that is the immediate presence of what we're looking at. But I think that in many cases, what we are confronted with in contemporary archaeology is an inability to distinguish the deep from the surface, where things are becoming entangled or producing a kind of meshwork or at least a mess, where in more ordinary or conventional kinds of archaeology, the challenge for the archaeologist is then to distinguish all of the mess and find out what's proper past and what's new. And
sort of sift through everything.
Exactly, and then classify and temporalize or periodicize and so. And I think that it's more productive in contemporary archaeology to allow things to be this kind of temporal mess, because that is really, if we go look at post-industrial landscapes, it's really what we're encountering today is the presence of something that is left as both old and new and not really distinguishable in terms of their different kinds of chronological parameters. So I think that it's about that kind of chronological realism, is to accept the mess as a mess.
Accept the chaos.
Yeah.
But then when we do distinguish, I mean, archaeologists do end up finding what they want to look deeper into. What can we then learn from studying these modern ruins and objects from our own time? And what is the difference between, for example, studying ruins of the ancient past, like Roman ruins or something, versus studying buildings from the last century? What is the difference there?
Well, I think that doesn't always need to be a difference between them, but I think that sometimes the connections between these kinds of ruins is actually more interesting than their distinctions. But if I were to point to a few things that I find particularly rewarding in terms of our contemporary ruins or the traces in our landscape in that sense, is that one of the ways that the past is produced is by compartmentalizing it as something that we can appropriate in a retrospective way, where it becomes something that belongs to the past. And I think that when we're looking at the contemporary ruin, we have to admit to ourselves that it doesn't belong to the past. It's part of our own social, cultural makeup. And in that way, we need to deal with it somehow as an archaeological presence in the everyday landscape, where we need to face it and confront ourselves with the social and economic and aesthetic reality of those kinds of ruins. And of course, ancient ruins, of course, are also something we confront, at least aesthetically. But when we're talking about the social and the economic aspects of proper heritage ruins of the deep past, then we're usually talking about them as resources in the tourist industry. Then they are sites for visiting by massive amounts of tourists, or they can be somehow commercialized or turned into national relics. And I think that these kinds of ruins that we're talking about from the present day, they're not relics in the sense of pointing backwards. They are really pointing to an issue that we need to deal with right now. And I think that in some cases they are also offering something different from other kinds of sources. So say some of the references I made earlier to people inhabiting ruins today, they're usually people who are not too keen on or even have the ability to speak. They're not heard, and you can't approach them in an ethnographic interview or as a journalist necessarily.
Yeah.
So what we can do is look at what they're leaving behind, the traces they're leaving behind archaeologically. And sometimes that's the only trace they make in the world. So I think that there's also an archaeological responsibility in looking at those kinds of remains of people or societies, communities that don't really have the ability, have the power to leave other traces than those.
To sort of use the traces to lend a voice to these vulnerable. And now you're already talking about some of the ethical and maybe even legal issues in properly exploring these subjects. And as you said, some of these places could be places of significance for living communities, right? And handling such recent history, I imagine that means you have to tread really carefully, right?
Yeah, there's a host of ethical considerations to be made in this respect. And one is, of course, that there can be serious issues about being exposed, being revealed for some of those who are living lives voluntarily or involuntarily on the fringes of the legal framework.
Yeah.
There's, of course, also something about social dignity, pride, having the ability to look yourself in the mirror, as we say, without being exposed as someone who's in the bottom of society. Because there's so many different kinds of normative moral hierarchies associated with these kinds of sites. So if we're talking about abandoned homes in rural districts in the socioeconomic margins of even a place like Denmark, where we're usually talking about it as a country with a certain kind of prosperity, then there's still some tensions in terms of social identity and personal tragedy and so on. And that's really a concern, that we're not exposing people, but that we are talking about their conditions for living, or even just facing up to the fact that it's also about entire societies and communities sometimes, that we are not suddenly painting a picture of the socioeconomic margin as being uniformly poor or in some kind of destitution. It's not an even picture out there. And it shouldn't be the view from Copenhagen, where we're just painting the margin as something uniform.
Yeah.
So that's also social and political concern in that respect. And then, of course, many other even just very basic elements, like when you are working there, field working archaeologically, you take photographs or you collect objects. They can be personal objects where, we would never be concerned about that if we were talking about the Stone Age.
No.
But this is actually people who may still be alive that have left these things behind. It may be their parents or grandparents, or it may be neighbors, or it may be just the expression of this community, this neighborhood, where we're not free just to look at what some may call trash or ruins as a resource that we can just roam around and take out all the good stuff.
One man's trash is another man's treasure, right?
Exactly, but sometimes that treasure can be really, really delicate and difficult to work with. So it's not just a cultural relic, it's also a very sensitive kind of object.
And I think you're right about the thing with the city people having a tendency to look at everything outside of the city as sort of this uniform mass, and then the people living on the fringes of society getting overlooked pretty often.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely this perspective about university archaeology as coming from a certain kind of perspective. And of course, I also collaborate with archaeologists working in the museum sector outside of the cities. And I think that has certain advantages, because the museums are at least sometimes part of local communities and need to be embedded in those kinds of political and social economic processes. And there may be different kinds of attitudes and sensitivities seen from those perspectives. But of course, I also try to have those concerns myself, also being born and raised and coming from the countryside myself.
Yeah.
So it's not too alien for me.
what do you see happening next? How is the field of contemporary archaeology evolving, and what can we expect in the future?
Yeah, that's one of those questions where listening back on this 10 years ahead will be
really
difficult.
fun.
Yeah, it will be fun and maybe embarrassing. I think that what we are confronted with in the world today is a host of processes that we would probably characterize as rather as being in a certain kind of turmoil politically, but also processes in terms of the material makeup of the world, the changeability in climate, the changeability in waste and consumption patterns, and the different kinds of shifts of populations in terms of migration. And I think that archaeologists will have to respond, at least archaeologists working in contemporary archaeology, but also beyond, will have to respond to some of those concerns, because I don't think it will be possible to work in archaeology in the future and then say, but I'm just studying the past. I think that is, first of all, too comfortable, but I also think if archaeology is going to maintain that position, it also signals a lack of concern and awareness and responsibility for being an academic discipline in the world and not just looking at it as a microcosm in a lab. Contemporary archaeology in particular, I think, will have to deal with these kinds of multi-layered processes, because remains that we are looking at today and being produced today are not just cultural artifacts. They're not just eco-facts. They're not just in one area or the other. They're not just from the past or in the present. They are all of those things at any given time altogether. So I think that there'll be a different kind of attention to the entanglement of all of these different kinds of zones of interest, and perhaps also an awareness about the inability to make those distinctions and still make the world make sense. So I think that that's a rather conceptual or theoretical response, but I think that those are some of the ways of thinking about archaeological traces that we need to foreground.
All right. Well, thank you, Tim. And before we start rounding off, let's just bring it back to the beginning. We've heard lots about contemporary archaeology, and I feel like I've entered a whole new world. But here at the end, what are some of the absolute key takeaways that our listeners should bring with them? You get a quick summary, Tim. The floor is yours.
Well, I think that, first of all, what I would like to see contemporary archaeology as would be as an invitation for a broader kind of archaeology. So it doesn't mean that I'm going to give up thinking about archaeology as a professional discipline where you need training and you need some kind of methods and theoretical awareness and so on. But I think that looking at the world archaeologically also means that we can start thinking about the traces that we are leaving behind ourselves.
Amazing. Really to the point. Thank you so much, Tim. It's been great having you.
And thank you for having me.
And thank you, dear listener, for tuning in to this episode of Let's Dig Deeper. I hope you've learned lots and that you're now ready to dig up your own backyard. And if you have any questions or suggestions for the podcast, you can reach us at letsdigdeeperpodcast@gmail.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. I'm Zinat Haroun, and I've been your host. You can reach me on Instagram at @z_archaeology. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time where we will dig deeper into another topic. Bye.